Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum. This is one of over 1,000 programs we've done since the pandemic began. We are live streaming in John Judas. We've had him here many times before. Welcome, and we hope you come back and see some more as well. But today we're going to talk with John Judas about his latest book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? A very interesting analysis of a long period of history of Democratic relationship with the working class voters that usually were its base. So thanks for coming back, John, and appreciate your being here.
I appreciate your asking me. I wish I was there in person.
Yeah. So the background you talk about when you say where have all the Democrats gone, you point out that certain Democrats have not done what, Democratic leaders have not done exactly what you would have expected them to do in dealing with the working class or their base. So why don't you go back and take a little bit of the history, like what did FDR do to create this merger, and where did it go from there? It's just like a big overview of it, so what you're talking about is clear.
Well, the strength of the Democratic Party, when it's been at its high point, really was the Jacksonian era, the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, and the Roosevelt era. And what marked both of those, and again, I'm not justifying all the I know who Andrew Jackson is, and Roosevelt had his problems, but the strength of those parties were that they were seen as the party of, in Jackson's case, the common man, and Roosevelt, you could say, the common man and woman. He used to talk about the forgotten American. And they hit that sweet spot of the American electorate. And by doing that, they put the other part, the rival party, the Whigs in one case, the Republicans in the other, as the parties of the elites or the business or what have you. So that was really the key to the success of the Democratic Party. Democratic presidential candidates and congressional candidates continued to talk about that, but the party sometime in the 1970s or so lost it and could no longer credibly represent itself as a party of the common man and woman. And you really remember that, from Ronald Reagan, who was able to do this incredible trick in spite of his own politics, in spite of his many of his views, I would say, did not redound to the benefit of average Americans, was able to present himself as a representative of that part of America. So something happened during that period. And the thesis of our book is that it's not just a matter of what we want the Democrats to do. It would be fine if the Republicans did that, but we need a party in America that represents the many and not the few, that can speak for for our broken tax system, for instance, which just incredibly favors the wealthy. That can have programs, again, that benefit the many and not the few. So it's that's really what we're trying to do with the book. I think we're not trying to sort of predict the way things are going, but we're trying to present the way we think things should go.
So whether a politician misrepresents their position or not, which is not exactly the only time that's ever happened. But your basic idea is that Ronald Reagan, in making that appeal, and Donald Trump in making that appeal, have grabbed something that they really didn't have a right to, but that the Democrats, as if it was a possession that they didn't take care of or didn't watch over.
Yes, that's right. And you could look at something like Obamacare, made again with best of intentions, but deeply compromised in terms of its formulation with insurance companies, drug companies, and so on. So that when it comes out, when it appears, one of the results of it is that let's say, I don't have the exact number, but people who make less than $50,000 or $60,000 get a subsidy. But all of a sudden, when you get to that level, the middle class level, the premiums actually jump because they don't get a subsidy. So the appearance again was that this was a policy where the middle class was having to subsidize and pay for the lower class. It was seen as a subsidy for the poor, for minorities or whatever, and was very unpopular. A policy like Social Security, on the contrary, popular, universal. So I think that with the best of intentions, the Democrats still have had an approach, for instance, to social policy that doesn't get at this core idea that they're the party of the many, but positions them as the party that wants to get the working class or the middle class to pay for the poor. And they would say, well, why isn't the upper class paying for it? Why aren't kids being bused to fancy suburban schools? This was a big problem right in the 1970s, a big issue. Why are white working class people from South Boston having to pay for years of segregation? Why isn't it these wealthy suburbs? So I think, again, that something was lost in terms of the Democratic approach to policy. And, we have an explanation of why that happened that I can go into if you want. I mean, that's the...
Well, yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the book is, you grant the desire and the policies as being well-intentioned. But one of the things you didn't hit precisely on the head, but you hinted at, is that those policies that were put in place with those even decent intentions probably had a counterproductive effect on the race relations, on the relations between the poor and the middle class over time, because it was perceived as unfair.
Yes, that's right.
And therefore, people resent that and get angry about it, and anger is not a good thing for any of these divisions in our society.
Well, let's talk about the most explosive issue, the one of race. You can't say that the Democrats did the wrong thing by being the supporters of civil rights in the 1960s, of those big laws. That was something noble and something that should happen. And sometimes you have to do things that don't necessarily make you popular and give you big majorities. So let's grant that. But what happens afterwards is that the Democrats lose sight of the idea that they have to have policies that benefit all races, middle class as well as the lower class, and what you begin to get, again, when I mentioned the busing controversy, the perception, again, that the Democrats are focused on welfare, that in terms of crime, they're more worried about the criminals than the victims. You have all these kinds of charges come up that have some basis in the 1970s and the 1980s, and that help the Republicans come back and become competitive, become equal to the Democrats, if not in the 1980s superior to them electorally. So that's the real problem.
You don't touch on it at great length, but you touch on Carter's presidency. Do you feel that Carter was a transition away from the older idea that because he doesn't seem as a person to be that kind of a leader, but you think that the Democrats started to lose it and that's why Reagan was able to take it away?
Well, Carter, the Carter election was a kind of illusion. Kevin Phillips wrote this book, The Emerging Republican Majority, in 1970, and he really understood that if you put together the traditional Republican vote, again, the prairie states, some basis in the Northeast, business, small business, with the George Wallace vote, the backlash to the Democrats on civil rights. And also on the counterculture of the 60s, because Wallace really got both of those. If you put those together, you'll have a Republican majority replacing the Democratic majority. And when Ruy Teixeira and I did the emerging Democratic majority, we could even show in terms of numbers that Nixon's vote in 1972 was the Republican vote from 1968 plus Wallace's vote. That's how he got a landslide. Now, so then you get Watergate, and you get the Republican Party destroyed for at least 2 elections by that, and it creates an illusion when Carter comes into office that the Democrats really have this enormous majority in the country and in Congress, because you have a veto-proof Senate, you have a huge majority in the House. So, the Carter people and liberals at the time, and I remember thinking this myself, this is a time when we can do anything. We should have a full employment bill that guarantees employment to everybody. We're going to redo the tax code. We're going to redo campaign finance. We're going to get some kind of national health insurance. We're going to get a consumer advocacy agency that Ralph Nader is going to inspire. So they had all these plans, and they got to they got to the actual Congress, and they found out that it was an illusion, that a lot of the Democrats were more moderate and conservative, and they couldn't get majorities. And I think the 2 things that were really important were, first, they wanted to do labor law reform, because the corporations were beginning to do this very aggressive campaign to knock out the unions. They were doing things that in some cases were illegal under labor law reform, but there were the penalties were so minimal that it was cost effective for them to fire organizers, for instance. So they were doing a lot of things, and they were starting to succeed. So the AFL-CIO and liberal Democrats wanted to reform the labor laws. And here again, that was one of the first things. Democrats can't do it. They come within 1 vote of winning in the Senate, but they lose, and that's the end of that. Tax reform. Carter wanted to eliminate a lot of the business loopholes. The 3 martini lunch, it was called. So we had this big tax reform bill. And what happens with it is, by the time that the lobbyists and the politicians, including the Democrats, get around to passing something, it's exactly the opposite of what the original bill did. It reduces capital gains. It makes the tax code more regressive rather than more progressive. So you really have, during that Carter era, the breakdown of the New Deal Democratic politics. It just becomes very difficult. And if you go from there to Reagan, he pursues a lot of the things that the Republicans in Congress and the think tanks and the groups had wanted to do in the 1970s. The air controller strike, the labor board under Reagan allows companies to replace striking workers. This is something that was not done before. So it's during that period that you get the erosion of the labor movement in America. I mean, one of the key things to the success of the Democrats as the party of the common man and woman in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was that about 1/3 of American workers belonged to unions. And, add that again to their family members, and you get the basis for a real majority there, because not only do they contribute people and money, they're also the key organizers within state and local elections. So as the labor movement begins to lose power, the Democrats themselves, within the people who count, lose their focus. If you think of a party as having a kind of governing class of institutions and people, big shots, big institutions, big business. Well, in the 50s and 60s, big labor was a lot of that. By the 1980s, no, it was just another interest group. I mean, there was the AARP, there was environmental groups, and then there were the labor unions. Again, it was no longer that it had this kind of veto over anti-liberal conservative legislation. And that really changes the Democratic Party. And it makes it such that when they get around to doing legislation, there isn't that big push from the bottom. I mean, it's fine if it's legislation on the environment and things like that. Or you know, you go later to the kind of social issues of our century, gay rights. Because the business, let's say Wall Street, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, is fine with all those social issues. And so you get an alliance between them and the groups that come out of the 60s, the environmental organizations, feminists, civil rights, and they have a lot of clout in Washington. But the labor movement used to be central to the Democratic Party, and it no longer is. It's just another group. And that's really one of the key factors that changes the way the Democratic Party operates when it comes down to finally doing something and representing, the middle of America.
It's interesting. I mean, the way you pursue this it's almost as if the Republicans have had the majority ever since 1970, with Carter being a slight exception, but not as clear as it was. The Reagan Revolution not being such a revolution, but just part of the process. And the fact that there were 12 years in a row there, before Clinton, and Clinton came in with 42% of the vote, right? And then governed from the middle as well. And then you said Obama also governed not in favor of the Labor Party. So you analyze Joe Biden as closest back to the way that the Democrats used to run things. Do you see it that way, given that he's, given what's going on right now in the election coming up?
I think Biden was a throwback, and he was a throwback partly too because a lot of some of the business Democrats started to recognize that they'd gone off the track. Let's say on trade with China and industrial policy, and that. So there wasn't the same kind of pushback on those kind of issues, or financial regulation that you saw in the 1990s, where Democrats really, it was fine with them if you deregulated finance. So there was a change there. But again, Biden was an old style Democrat himself, and he understood, for instance, that Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again." During that 2016 election, I was just struck by both Obama and Hillary Clinton said, well, this doesn't make any sense. America is great again. They didn't get that something had been lost, that people didn't want goods anymore that were made in America. And then that was something that really was a problem. And so also the question of unity, of not just the Democrats being an assemblage of different ethnicities and races and religions, but a united party. So Biden talked about the United States of America. So he did bring back a lot of those themes, but underneath that, he really couldn't combat the kind of erosion of support that the Democrats had suffered over the 30 years. So a lot of his success was he won marginally back some of those white working class voters in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that had deserted the Democrats in 2016. but he didn't transform the party. And, now they're in big trouble.
You indicate from the statistics, you have a lot of interesting statistics in your book too, but you indicate from the statistics that a lot of local Republicans running did better than Trump did in terms of the percentage of the vote in 2020, right? That there were more Republican votes than there were Trump votes.
Yeah, well, I think that was true in 2016 as well. I mean, I always thought if it would have been Kasich, Rubio, or some, combination of them, the Republicans would have done even better. I mean, there's been a kind of ironic thing. Let's take the issue of trade. Because of Clinton's support for NAFTA in 1993, and then for China entering the WTO, a lot of the blame for trade policies and what happened in all these, small and mid-sized industrial towns in the South and Midwest came to the Democrats, even though in some of those cases, I mean, Clinton passed NAFTA with Republican votes. It lost in the House he needed Republicans in order to pass the bill in the House of Representatives. So, it's this kind of odd situation, and you find it now in the House of Representatives for the Republicans, where they really do not represent the interests of the average American and what they're doing. I mean, the main priority that the new Republican House, when they came in 2023, was to get rid of the tax audits on rich people. So, it's a very odd situation. I mean, Trump did understand a lot of the politics and what changed. He had this kind of intuitive understanding of how you had to get rid of the old Republican economics and how you had to also repudiate the forever wars and the war in Iraq, which was, that was a Republican war. So he did have this intuitive understanding, but that party is still pretty divided. I'm not saying that Republicans have now become the party of the common man and woman. In fact, both parties are screwed up. And elections are being fought pretty much by which party can make the other party's extreme wing the most notorious part of the election. So, if the Republicans can make the election over illegal immigration and defund the police, they're going to win. If the Democrats can make it over banning abortion and Trump destroying democracy, they're going to win. But in both those cases, I mean, you're talking about addressing the most extreme sides of each party.
You brought up immigration, illegal immigration, and you have a very interesting section in your book about that. And you bring up the Hesburgh Committee, Theodore Hesburgh being picked to lead it. He was the president of Notre Dame University at the time in the 1980s. And they had a particular approach to it. It's detailed, but I think it's worth talking about in detail, because it showed that someone thought it all through. and it wasn't the usual committee where they didn't happen. They seemed to have thought it through and said, you can't do this without this or it won't work, can't do this without this or it won't work. But they thought that they had a solution to the problem, which was never actually put into effect. But why don't you explain that? Because I got the impression that you would like that to come back and be used.
I've been thinking about it this week because there's immigration is a big issue now in Washington. And it's an instance where I think the Democrats aren't listening to the electorate. And some of the Republican stuff is a little screwy, but I agree with some of the things that they're criticizing the Democrats for. In the 1980s and 1990s, you had first this committee that was organized. The chair was Father Hesburgh from Notre Dame, notable civil rights figure in America, liberal. Then in the 1990s, you had a very similar committee that was chaired by Barbara Jordan, black woman, congresswoman from Texas. Again, very notable figure for her. She gave a great keynote address at the Democratic Party convention. So you had both these, and both of them were oriented around the same kind of ideas. First of all, you couldn't continue to have enormous numbers of low-wage, unskilled workers coming into the country, whether they came legally or illegally. The effect of which was to put enormous pressure on workers who are already here, who only had, let's say, a high school education. What you were going to do was we're going to create tremendous surpluses at the bottom of the workforce and bring down wages and put these workers at the mercy of employers. And they were absolutely right. And what happens in the 1980s and 1990s is, again, a lot of employers bring in both legal and illegal immigrants, and they also use that to break unions, to create a situation where, let's say, the meatpacking industry, which used to be a middle-class industry, it used to be a good job to get, becomes a very, very dangerous low-wage job. And they do that partly by completely transforming the workplace itself. So the approach of the Hesburgh and Jordan committees was, you've got to do something about the illegal immigrants who are already here. You can't have them just remain an exploitable class. People who are at the mercy of employers and emergency rooms. So they were for some kind of path to citizenship for them, and it becomes part of the 1986 legislation. But they also said you have to do something to discourage illegal immigration. And the thing that they, both of them hit on was you have to penalize employers who do this, who bring in, put ads in newspapers in Mexico to recruit people to come into the country to replace the workers they have. So both of them advocated that. They had this kind of, on the one hand, on the other hand approach. Which I think makes a lot of sense. Jordan and Hesburgh also thought that you had to orient the immigration around bringing in skilled workers that America actually needed at the time, rather than creating, again, this surplus at the bottom. So they had, again, that was another part of their approach. What happens is that they get pushed aside, and that approach really becomes repudiated. It was at the beginning in the 1980s, both the labor unions and the NAACP supported it. The only real opposition was business and some Hispanic lobbies, who were very unhappy with the idea of forcing employers to verify whether their workers were eligible to work or not. We're having exactly the same fight now in Washington. If you look at the Republican H2, it's called, the bill that they passed that could become a basis of shutting down the government again. One of the things it does have in it is this E-Verify system, where the employers have to use the National Computer Database Social Security numbers to verify that their workers are actually eligible to work in the United States. The problem with the Republican approach is that, as far as the legal immigrants now, they want to just deport them. So it's sort of a kind of screw you to them. Mm-hmm. So again, I think the approach of Hesburgh and Jordan was really commendable, because it looked at the problem from both sides, both eliminating this pool of illegal immigration in the country by offering a path to citizenship, but also securing our borders and securing people overstaying visas, not through necessarily making a wall, but step to making it illegal for employers to hire people who are in the country illegally. And that remains, I think, a key. I think a lot of the issue about putting more police on the border and whatever is just not going to do the trick. I mean, we keep building walls, and it doesn't solve the problem.
A lot of the comments that you make in your book and analyses sound like they would appeal to the middle 60% of the vote or whatever. And the parties, as you said, are both obsessed with their extremes and making them happy. So do you think that leaves a wide opening for a third party moderate? I mean, obviously the, what's it called? The no title.
No labels.
No labels policy doesn't seem like they have the right PR behind them. But but do you think that there's a possibility of that? Not obviously next year, but sometime if this keeps up?
Well, no. In terms of third party, our first past the post election system, where the party that gets a plurality wins, is just not conducive. The third party become spoilers, and it's very hard to have a viable third party. But having said that, there is this incredible hole in the electorate. If you look at the Gallup surveys of Democrats, Republicans, and people who either are independents or decline to state, if you go back 15 years, I think maybe to 2008, if you look at it, you get 35 Democrat, 25 Republican, and 35 or something like that. You get slight Democratic edge, but you get independents about a little less than Democrats or equal to. Now, if you go at it, it's like 25 the parties and 50 independents. Mm-hmm. So those aren't people who are going to vote independent. A lot of them lean Democratic or they lean Republican, and some of the political scientists will tell you it's all an illusion. But I don't think it's an illusion. I think it represents a real dissatisfaction with the choices that people are facing when they go to the polls. And so there is an opening for a new kind of politics, but I think it's going to have to come through one or the other parties. And you do see that. You see it in the Republican Party. There are these organizations, think tank magazines. I've mentioned one called American Affairs. There's a think tank called American Compass that want to create a kind of, if you want to call it a sanitized Trump politics, but a politics that's based around the needs of American workers. And actually, they're pro-union. It's amazing. But within the Republican Party, it's very hard for those kind of groups to gain a lot of influence. But again, I mean, I think you'll find in both parties, you'll find tendencies toward creating this new kind of, you could call it centrist politics, but not yet, and we're stuck. And I'm not sure I see a way out short of a new kind of crisis that forces the parties to really rethink.
And do you think part of the issue for both parties, since we're being equal here, is that sort of the baby boom generation just doesn't stop, staying in power? It took a while to take over, but the average age of political leadership has got to be the highest it's ever been. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it sure seems like it. And that maybe that's kind of stifling the process as well. Not that we're not the same.
You're not wrong about the age thing. I mean, I don't think we've ever, and people are becoming more functional. I say myself, right, as they get older, but we've never had this kind of gerontocracy in America. I mean, it's so Macron of France just appointed this 34-year-old prime minister. Again here, it's distressing to say this, but I think the Republicans in some way have a stronger bench than the Republicans, and there are more people in the 50-year-old, 40-year-old range who are just at least starting to rethink. I'm thinking about Rubio, Hawley, J.D. Vance. Some of those people, I mean, there's, again, I think you can see them kind of rethinking. I'm worried about the Democrats that there's an absence of people. You have the politician like Sherrod Brown from Ohio that I thought was really on the right track. Marcy Kaptur from Ohio, she's like 80 years old. So you really don't have a strong base within the Democratic Party that's trying to rethink along these lines.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've been getting a lot of questions for you and from the audience that's watching, so that's great. And I think I'm going to put a few in right away because they're going to cover the same topics I was anyway. So we've got one from Susan Pfeiffer. She says, this is going to the Affordable Care Act. She said, the ACA was the only way we could get the idea of the Affordable Care Act across the finish line for a first iteration. The idea was to get it in use for a few years, see how it worked, and then fix it. But we never got a majority again to fix it. It's still ACA 1.0. Do you agree with that analysis?
I think that's completely right. I mean, what we used to think at the time, I mean, people who were had looked through America to the country with rosy-colored glasses like myself, was we used to say, well, Social Security was completely flawed at the beginning. I mean, both poor whites and blacks really got screwed because agricultural workers weren't included, all those domestic workers. But it got improved, and by the 1950s, it was great. Mm-hmm. With the Affordable Care Act, you had the same kind of compromises at the beginning, but because our politics is locked into this kind of unstable equilibrium where we rarely have a situation where one party is completely in control, either Democrats or Republicans, you do one thing and then the other party comes in and screws around with it. And, you strengthen the Environmental Protection Agency, and then Trump comes in and gets rid of half the people. So we have this very difficult situation. Biden did a lot of interesting things in his first 2 years. For the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, but he's not going to do anything these next 2 years. Everything is completely stalemated. So yes, that's a key problem in our politics. And again, that's why I think we have this crazy situation where about half the electorate finds itself throwing up its hands and saying, well, I'm an independent, or I decline to state which party I identify with, because they see such a paralysis in Washington.
I thought it was very indicative of that paralysis that Representative Kevin McCarthy, was not able to hold on to the speaker position after having tried so hard to get it, and that the replacement is probably going to end up with the same policies or whatever, but that there's like an internal fight. You would think that they would want to get rid of those 25 people that are stopping them. Yeah,
I know, but they have this. They have the power to get rid of the speaker. There's a lot of fighting today. This guy Johnson might be a smart guy, though. I mean, he handled it so far pretty well. I'm not commending what he did, but he's managed to handle the crazies surprisingly well. He might turn. McCarthy did not. He could not deal with them. And, we've had this succession after Paul Ryan of speakers who are at a loss to create majorities, political majorities. And so you get shutdowns of the government, and they themselves now realize that when they shut the government down, it doesn't help their electoral chances as a national party, even if it might make their constituents happy.
Mm. All right, well, here's another question from the audience. Help us understand the Democrats' relentless focus on identity politics and the oppressed-oppressor framework.
Oh, that's somebody who will like our book.
Yeah. You had a whole chapter on this, so.
Now we have the book is divided into two parts, and the first part is mostly about the economy, and the second part is about cultural radicalism. Mm-hmm. It's hard for me to understand how it happened for the Democratic Party that they have become so focused on these issues. Again, I'm totally against discrimination against transgender people, but how did this become such a huge issue? I mean, I understand defund the police and things like that, because that comes out of the George Floyd killing. So there really is, again, a set of incidents. But one of the things we talk about in the book is that the parties themselves used to be, you could make a division between the governing class of a party, which was, again, big labor, big business, big agriculture, whatever, and the electorate. But with the growth of the internet, especially in the 90s, influence becomes much more dispersed, and you get the development of all these kind of institutions that aren't necessarily part of the official party, but that are still identified with the Democrats. So you get MSNBC, you get all these publications, websites, foundations, etc. And you get the same thing with the Republican, with the Koch brothers and Americans for Prosperity and the evangelical groups. And these kind of shadow groups, so we call them a shadow party, become very influential. Within the Democratic Party, the shadow groups, again, we're talking about the foundations, the media, very much grow out of this division of the country between the large post-industrial metro centers that specialize in finance, computer information, universities, advanced healthcare, all these kind of things, and small town and midtown America that's more identified with resource extraction. What exists of manufacturing, farming, oil, coal mining. So you get that kind of division in the country. Within these advanced metro centers, they're very dominated by professionals, again, college-educated, advanced degree, and by what you would call the vanguard of this group. That's use an old Marxist term, which who are very much into the identity politics and again, very extreme views on race and immigration, on sex, also on climate change, a kind of view a catastrophic view that we're about to extinguish the planet by 2030. And they dominate again, the shadow party of the Democrats. So I've given a kind of fuzzy explanation, but that's a lot of what goes on. And in the Democratic Party, too, I think it skews young. The shadow party skews young. In the Republican Party, it tends to skew old. So if you look at let's say, the Bernie Sanders voters versus the Trump voters, you get this incredible age difference between them.
Yeah, but Bernie and Trump were about the same age.
Yes, exactly.
And
me.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned there that I think we can go into a little bit more detail, you talk about when someone doesn't have power, what do they do? And I think you quoted someone as saying you can control hiring practices, firing practices, and words. I don't remember where that came from, but it was an interesting way of analyzing what's going on, because there's a lot of hiring and firing problems going on too. That's part of this cultural change. But the word.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the political correctness and the language and all that stuff. Again, I think there's an element of mystery to that. And I think that you have to look at the enormous impact of social media. I would say, what you find there is an intersection of social media on the one hand and a kind of religious impulse. That reflects a certain kind of concern about the country and the way the country's gone, the lack of a common religion, the decline of organized religion. The political correctness is the counterpart among Democrats and among these Democratic shadow party of right-wing evangelicism is among the Republicans. They're sort of they're the matched extremes. So again, that's where I would see it.
You use the word neo-Puritanism for some of it, and I've heard that
yes,
in a couple
absolutely.
of other places. So.
I once wrote an article about the weathermen. Remember I'm not talking about the meteorological, but the political group of the 1960s when they were having trouble. And I called it when the visible saints go marching out. Yeah. Because the visible saints were pure in the American Puritanism from the 17th century. If you were part of the elect, if you were a part of God's chosen, you were a visible saint. And there was a kind of moralism, again, that started in the 60s and has recurred and revived now about being pure in your ideas and in your ideals, and free from all the taint of whatever phobia or ism or emisy you can talk about. And again, you can look at the controversy over diversity, equity, and inclusion that's going on. When we looked at the polling and stuff from the 2016 election, the single biggest issue that drew voters to Trump was the political correctness stuff. Mm-hmm. And, you could see that when they did the Access Hollywood, the Democrats, and I think the Trump people themselves thought I hope you know what I'm referring to, the thing where he was talking about women in a derogatory way and whoever he had screwed or whatever. It was very gross, but the assumption again among Democrats was this is the end of him, but it wasn't the end of him because there are a lot of people in the country who think, well, they won't let us just talk like we think, and again, they want to turn America into a church of political correctness. So that remains a big problem. It pops up with this Harvard stuff, bloody and gay. I mean, it's all over the place.
You also mentioned, and I think it's always useful to mention the historical thing, is that this kind of apocalyptic thinking, I think you mentioned in terms of the climate change one, that kind of apocalyptic thinking has been a part of American culture for its entire history. Maybe it's a slightly higher percentage right now, but it has always been a strong strain of apocalyptic thinking.
Yes, absolutely. And it's especially common in it starts with the millennialism of the Puritans, and it carries through to the Millerites, the Seventh-day Adventists. The world was going to end, and in the 1950s, when I was growing up, we thought the world was going to end from nuclear war, and we did all these air raid drills, where you'd get under your seat. And
get under the desk is very helpful, to get under that desk.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. Yeah. You didn't have to do all the other boring things. And there, among the young people, there's an element of that goes into thinking about the climate. And Again, we're not deniers. We think there's a real problem and that we have to do something about it. But there's a fear, there's an exaggerated fear that if we don't do anything, if we don't get rid of all fossil fuels by the year 2030, the planet is doomed. And I think that that's a kind of religious thinking.
So, very interesting, because that's a second version. You use the same thing about identity politics, that maybe the loss of standard religious, middle of the road religious beliefs. I'm sure they wouldn't like it being called that, but from the 1950s and 60s, that sort of everybody was in one category or another, or almost everybody. The loss of that has made the search for some alternative, even if it's totally unconscious, creates these kind of extremes that seems to be driven by religious type beliefs or religious.
Yeah, I can't understand it all. I mean, when I was first going to college, these books came out like Growing Up Absurd by Paul Goodman and Coming of Age in America by Edgar Friedenberg. Mm-hmm. And they seemed to really understand what this generation was going to go through, the alienation. We were all going to work, in these big corporations. And there's something going on now among young people that we don't entirely understand. And there's people like Jonathan Haidt and Gene Twenge from San Diego State, who have written about it and who attribute a lot of it to on the one hand, social media, and on the other hand, the change in parenting. Kids are no longer having the same kind of independent play that they had when they grew up. Mm-hmm. And, you find among the young, when I wrote about Bernie Sanders followers, you find among young, both in the United States and in Europe, a real anti-establishment view. Mm-hmm. Most of the in the Germany and in France, the right-wing populist parties, they're young. They skew very young. So there's something happening among young people, and we don't completely understand it. John Haidt talks about the incidence of mental illness, which has gone way up among teens. Mm-hmm. Some of the sexual identity stuff also very prevalent among young people. Why now? I mean, why are people unsure about whether they're really a man or a woman, or whether, again, the growth of binary, all these initials and stuff. So there's something going on, and we don't really fully understand what it is, and it's contributing to our politics.
Question: do you know of any writers that you've read, younger writers, like under 35 or so, that have addressed this issue and have made it make more sense to you? Because that might be helpful to our readers too, because if they're trying to understand it. I know that you do a lot of reading in the area, so.
I don't do that much reading, but some of the stuff that you could read in Jacobin, for instance, which is a socialist publication, they don't like my views on immigration, but on other stuff that they have some interesting things to say. I listen to a lot of podcasts like everybody else, and so I think that's again, you'll find people there, but I don't have a list of things right now that I could tell you. I mean, I've been mainly rediscovering all these old novelists and stuff, so I haven't been reading enough. I could tell you about Wallace Stegner. I just rediscovered his novel.
That would be interesting. Well, let me cover one other. It's a very big question. That came in. What do you feel is the biggest challenge facing the Democratic Party, and then what about the Republicans? We kind of covered a little bit of it, but I don't know if that you consider it the biggest challenge, but dealing with their extremes is sort of what.
Well, it's very easy to say what the biggest challenge of the Republican Party is, and how to incorporate some of Trump, but not Trump, to get rid of him. And the only way they're going to do that is if he loses in in 2024. If he wins, it's not. I don't believe this stuff about fascism or dictatorship, but there's going to be real chaos, and you've seen nothing but the kind of crazy stuff we had in his first term. I would expect that would continue. So they really have to do that. But they have again a generation of people that might be able to pull it off once he leaves the stage. The Democrats again have a gerontocracy problem, and there's a big sort of gap between the older Bernie, Biden, Schumer, these people, and to go to the very younger, the people from the Squad who were Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Progressive Caucus, which again are too much tied, in my opinion, to the identity politics stuff, and you can see it on their unwillingness to rethink immigration in right now in the big debate that's going on. So I think the Democrats have to develop a leadership. The thing that remains for me is that I think the Republicans still are much more tied to business and to a corporate America and to a kind of inequality than the Democrats. And that's the abiding faith that the Democrats have in equality and for labor unions, even if the labor unions are weak, I think could carry them through. So my hope is that out of that, they will develop a leadership that understands that the American people are pretty much left center on economic policy, minimum wage, all that stuff, as long as it benefits everybody. It is not just targeted. And on cultural issues, very middle of the road, patriotic, anti-discrimination, but don't want policies that seem to just favor one group over all the others. So I have, in that sense, and that's why we wrote the book for addressed to Democrats, more hope that it will develop in the Democrats, but I don't see it clearly in terms of the people who are now in Congress.
Mm-hmm. So part of the way you analyzed in the book was that the Republicans had started to represent, at least in their words, the working class, and got their attention, got their votes, and took them away from the Democratic Party. But you don't think that their policies are lined up with that group anyway. I mean, it's not like they're in favor of unions or anything.
I think that I think they have a real problem with it, and that's, again, if you read this those various people that I mentioned. There's a publication called Compact too on the web that I would recommend. Those are people, many of whom are Republicans, who do understand this problem, that they have this, they've inherited this constituency. Some of the constituency comes theirs entirely from social issues and from the mistakes of the Democrats. But as far as what the Republicans themselves stand for, they don't have a lot to offer those voters. So that's the problem that they face.
Big question. The Republicans inherited the Wallace vote. Do you think that there's that big a segment of the population that still has that extreme views on race and so on? Or you seem to talk about a lot of people are against discrimination. So dealing with if the Republicans dealt with the working class, didn't like feed that anger and feed that issue, but took care of other issues that they have, whether that might not be a way to tone down the racial issues that seem to be worse than they were when we were young in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, South Carolina is where the Civil War started. Mm-hmm. It's where the Dixiecrats, Strom Thurmond, 1948, the rejection of Democrats on civil rights. They have a black senator now. Mm-hmm. Now, if we had old-fashioned racism of the George Wallace, we would not have South Carolina would not be electing a black senator. So that, yeah, a lot has changed in the last 40, 50, 60 years. Again, with Trump in 2016, I don't think it was white supremacy in terms of racism. But I think the immigration thing, the build the wall, was very important, and I think that'll be true in 2024. But a lot of those voters, Hispanic voters, Hispanic working class voters, Latinos, are starting to move toward the Republicans. So it's again, I think that a lot of Democrats want to excuse the problems that the party has by saying, well, it's just racists on the other side. Whereas what is happening, unbeknownst, I guess, to these people is that a lot of Latino, Asian American voters over the issue of affirmative action, and black voters over economic issues are moving toward the Republicans. So again, this is a big problem for the Democrats.
One of the statistics that you had was interesting, was that the Trump voters were more moderate on racial issues than the voters for Romney.
Yes, my co-author, Rui Teixeira, that's his specialty, is analyzing those public opinion, and he discovered that. Wow. That's true. But, I can't entirely explain it, and it's hard to explain in terms of what Trump has done in the last 3 or 4 years, from Charlottesville to now. Yeah. In 2020, in that election, he had this I know they did this in Virginia about housing regulations that required lower income housing to be built, apartments along with big ones, and it was clearly aimed at a racial vote. So, good luck if they want to elect Trump. I mean, yeah. But there are Republicans who are not racist, period. Yeah. And Republican politicians.
Yeah, so we're almost out of time. But if you would like the audience to kind of hear what it is that you want the Democratic leadership to hear from the book, we were talking about this just before we started. That there is, you feel that there's not much of a reaction by some. Others obviously are interested. To analyzing these problems in the Democratic vote. Because people were saying, well, the Democrats are going to completely take over and stay, and the Republican is the party that was self-destructing. And it seemed like it was self-destructing in many different ways. But neither party seems to be self-destructing when they should.
I guess that the two messages I would take is, the first is that, Obama had a chance when he had this big majority. Again, he came in 2009 to reform the labor laws to make it easier for unions to organize. That really has to be a priority for the Democrats if they want to change the party. There's no other way. The Republicans have had this enormous advantage for the last 20 or 30 years of having this organized base of churches, gun clubs, the Koch brothers network that underlies the party that they can count on, whereas the Democrats are much more diverse, split, divided. Again, that's one thing I would think of. That's very important. The other thing would be they recognize that there are huge cultural differences in the country between, you could say Middle America and the America of whatever, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., where I live, Boston. And the key in politics is not to win out on those issues, but to find some kind of common ground. And I think, again, if you look back at the 1930s, you'll see that that was part of what Roosevelt did. That was part of his genius. So we really have to do that and get away from the kind of ideological purity on these issues.
One last question on a very controversial subject of abortion. If you have sort of won, Trump has sort of won for the people who supported him, that issue. And it seemed to be an almost one issue concern for the evangelicals and other extremely religious people who that's just such an important issue. And now it's going to all the different states and everybody's experimenting with it again as it was before, but with different outcomes, different laws, et cetera. Do you think that will take one big piece out of the Republican, like really strong support and say, well, we've got what we want, and so now we're going to become apolitical again? Because they were fairly apolitical before the issue.
Oh, I think there's going to continue to be big fights about it because Democrats are going to try to make a national law out of it for abortion rights. So it will continue to be a major issue. I don't know what's going to happen on the abortion pills. That's going to be a huge issue because they want to ban those and make it states able to ban the use of them. So I would expect that. I mean, the thing that's odd about abortion is that on social issues, you really had, to a great extent, this kind of dominance of Washington politics from, the 90s and the early 2000s, of this alliance between the groups that come out of the 60s, feminist, civil rights, environmental, and business, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, whatever. So people really didn't expect that the evangelicals would get their way. And when they did, oh my God, with the Dobbs decision, that was an enormous earthquake for the electorate. And it remains so. Trump is starting to back away. I don't know if you notice this. He's started to say that states should not ban abortions outright. And the Democrats, on the other hand, are going to say, well, why do you think we have this Dobbs decision? It's because of the people that Trump brought onto the Supreme Court. So that's going to remain an issue because that's, again, that was an issue that people just took for granted and was also just snatched from under them. I mean, it would be as if Democrats decided that they were going to ban the use of non-electric cars all of a sudden.
Right.
And in Germany, they did something like that. The coalition, everybody was going to have a certain kind of non-gas heater by the year 2024. And lo and behold, the Alternative for Deutschland, the right-wing populist party, got all these votes in these last state and local elections, and a lot of that came as a backlash. So, I mean, the Democrats have their own kind of crazy issues, but abortion is one that's deadly for the Republicans.
No. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, John. That was a lot of great insights into what's happening. One last question. If you were to compare what you expect 2024 to be like as a presidential election year to all the other presidential election years you observed, where would you put it in terms of its craziness, expected craziness?
I don't have a comparison. I don't think the comparisons to 1948 that I hear are relevant at all. I mean, it's going to be fought over. Whether people think the president is too old or whether they think he's the other guy's too crazy. And
no policies at all, right?
Well, there'll be policies, but, those are really underlying everything. And in a way, they're more important, than immigration or inflation or anything like that. It's the doubts about Biden's age and the doubts about Trump's, at least his political sanity. I don't go for this thing that he's crazy or something like that.
Yeah.
But I like the Andrew Sullivan compared him to one of Shakespeare's mad kings, one of the Richards and something like that. That's what I think Trump is like.
Well, that gives us some hope because England survived.
Yes, that's right. But it took like 600 years.
Yeah. Well, we have time. No. well, thanks a lot, John. That was great. And we'll see you again when your next book comes out.
My pleasure.
And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 121st year of enlightened discussion. Thank you very much for joining us, and hope to come back to see us again soon.